this is a different spin on it. This is about the legalisation of cannabis. Now, Elton John calls the US legalisation of cannabis one of the greatest mistakes of all time. In the copy, essentially, he was speaking to Time magazine. He spoke of his past addiction and described marijuana's impact on his mental health. He said that the legalisation of marijuana in America and Canada, one of the greatest mistakes of all time. He goes on to say, I maintain it's addictive. It leads to other drugs. That's what we call a gateway drug. When you're stoned, and he says, I have been stoned, you don't think normally. This is what the 77-year-old said. There's a lot of discussion about our drug policy in this country. Our current drug policy, in my humble opinion, doesn't work. The classification of drugs doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense to me. The classification into class A, B and C. Professor David Nutt, if you remember, was on the advisory committee for drugs. He came up with a whole new classification system and said this is what we need to do, and the government at the time promptly fired him because they didn't like what he said. So the question is, what do we do? Is legalisation or decriminalisation of cannabis the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? Well, joining me now is Simon McLean, who's a former undercover detective at the Serious Drugs Crime Surveillance Squad. He's also a member of LEAP UK, that's Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Good morning to you.
Good morning, David. How are you? I'm
very well indeed, thank you. So, Elton John weighing into the debate here. Look, I've lived in America. I lived in LA. It is ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and you need a prescription, which you go to a shop anywhere, and you say, I've got back pain, sciatica, you've got anything, and you get given a prescription for cannabis. Just talk us through your thoughts on that, and certainly whether the use of cannabis, and certainly if you live in East London, or certainly in East London where I am, there is a permanent smell of cannabis.
Yeah, constantly. And everywhere you go, and everyone knows that. I love the strapline of your show, by the way, David. Good morning.
Good morning.
Common sense, speaking common sense, because that's really what we're all about at LEAP UK and LEAP Scotland. And it really is common sense. I go out and speak to organisations all the time, and within 5 minutes of speaking to them, they see the common sense of what we're saying here. I'd also like to say that Elton is a friend of ours at LEAP UK. I know that he very much supports an end to the war on drugs and the harms that are caused by prohibition. So Elton, probably the context is important here, which we tend not to get with these headlines. But I can empathise with Elton entirely, because I spent a career having that position. I was 29 years a police officer enforcing the drug laws that we have, the war on drugs, if you like. And if Elton's position was different, and it was that he agrees with prohibition and he thinks that enforcement is the way to go here, despite 53 years of failure in getting us to where we are today, then I could empathise with that, because most of the country have been hoodwinked through rhetoric for those 53 years to believe that we can solve the problems that we undoubtedly have in society. And remember that Scotland has the highest drug deaths in Europe, so I'm not being flippant here in any shape or form, that it's a serious problem that needs to be dealt with. And the Misuse of Drugs Act, prohibition and enforcement are never going to do that. In fact, they're part of the problem rather than part of the solution.
I would agree. And so just starting with cannabis, that we know that more than 20 US states, the District of Columbia, they've legalised, this is recreational marijuana for adults. We also know that Malta, Luxembourg, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany, many other European countries also have legalised it. So just in terms of that, we also have to make it very clear there's a distinction between cannabis, which was grown, say, 20, 30 years ago, and now skunk, which is a highly, highly potent strain.
Yes. David, to go back to Elton just for a second on that very subject, the truth is that Elton John, together with the other millions of users across the world who currently use cannabis or skunk on the illicit marketplace, have no idea what they're using. No idea whatsoever. Whatever Elton was being given was illegal, and it was sourced from people who were selling that for profit, and nobody had any idea what was actually in it.
Yeah.
As a police officer, we used to make seizures regularly, and send them to the laboratory for testing, and they came back as they weren't drugs at all. They were actually placebos, because dealers have no qualms whatsoever what they sell to their customers. So the answer to the skunk problem, I host a podcast, Crime Time Inc., with a former Deputy Chief Constable, and his position is nearer to what Elton is saying here, because he worries about those stronger strains of cannabis. And that falls straight into our lap, because what we need is regulation. We need people to know what they're buying, know what they're using, and be of age, and be responsible users, give them instructions, etc., how to use things, the same as we regulate alcohol and every other product that we consume in the marketplace.
You see, that seems eminently sensible to me, because this...
Common sense.
Well, it seems to be common sense, absolutely. And the politicians are the biggest barrier here, because they say they're going to win the war on drugs. I don't think that is possible. Kids, young people will take drugs. We know that. But also, surely, and your point is really valid, I'd rather that people took drugs, they know what they're taking, they know the dose of those drugs, they know the side effects of those drugs, and they can do it in safe spaces.
And David, we know who they are then, because they have to come to licensed premises, like we do with public houses. In Scotland, we've got a big debate just now about safe consumption, because we're opening the first safe consumption room in the UK. And my argument is that we have thousands of safe consumption rooms. We call them pubs, because you and I, when we go for a pint, it's a safe consumption room that we're going into, or a glass of wine in your case, probably, David.
No, definitely a pint.
A bit uncouth there, wasn't it? But it's totally regulated environment, the hours that it can be sold, the people it can be sold to, and crucially, what we're buying is regulated. And that's what's missing in our marketplace. So decriminalisation, we at LEAP UK and LEAP Scotland, we don't think about decriminalising the drugs. You can't decriminalise a thing. We can decriminalise people, because currently the people who use drugs on the marketplace. And remember that cannabis is already legal here in the UK. There are thousands and thousands of people getting the benefits of legally prescribed cannabis here in the UK, which is another market.
That's absolutely right. It's actually quite difficult to get hold of, and I've spoken to a lot of people with chronic neurological disease who are desperate to get hold of medical cannabis. It's much harder to get hold of than you think. But also, just in terms of police time, it seems to me that a huge amount of police time is wasted on trying to deal with this problem with cannabis. I was reading this article from Sophia Warringer, who is a friend of this programme. Essentially, police officers say they don't have the resources, they don't have the time to deal with cannabis and the use of cannabis. 2/3 of police officers think cannabis is, to all intents and purposes, actually fully or partially decriminalised in practice. So where do we go from here?
David, we did a talk not so long ago to the Police Superintendents Association of Scotland, which is effectively the leadership of Police Scotland. And I always start off these talks by taking a straw poll about who believes that prohibition and enforcement are the way forward. We just need more of it, if you like. And normally I get 80-90% of a conservative audience, 80 or 90% will raise their hand, because that's the way it's been ingrained into them over 50 years. When I did it last year in front of the Superintendents Association, nobody raised their hand. The police know that what they're being asked to do is not bearing fruit. They're also being asked to save lives on the streets at the same time. And the safe consumption rooms adds another dimension to that hypocrisy that we have. Everyone knows now, it's common sense, that this is not a criminal matter. We've tried for 50, if nothing else, we've tried for 53 years and failed miserably and have the worst record in Europe. Surely it's time to sit down around the table and get all the expertise that we have and all the data that we have and find a new way forward that's empathetic to people who have drug issues. Only a small proportion of us end up, I'm saying us because I have a pint, like I now know that you do, but I don't have a problem with it, thankfully. But only a small percentage of people who use any kind of drugs, including alcohol, end up with problematic with it. And those are the people that need our help and support rather than being ostracised and sent to criminals to buy the substance of choice.
And there is the problem. This any review that needs to take place has to be evidence-based. The problem is that politics and policies will always come in. Whenever a politician is asked, have you ever taken drugs, they invariably lie and say they haven't taken drugs, when we know pretty full well they probably did as a student or whatever. If you go down this, and we spoke about safe supplies, we know what's in it, they've been tested, the drugs have been tested, you know the dose of that drug. There is another part to this, which is actually you can tax them.
Yes. Well, I see that you had interesting facts at the start of the programme. I've got quite a few that I could give you, but one that I would pluck from that is that every single person, taxpayer in the UK, pays £400 a year towards enforcing the drug laws in this country.
Wow. That's a good fact.
It's a good fact.
It's a very good fact.
Well, it's not a good fact, but I know what you mean.
Well, yeah, so just in terms, if you were Home Secretary or if you were involved in the policy-making decision, if we agree that what we are doing so far does not work, the classification of drugs is arbitrary, so cannabis is in Class B, for example, cocaine in Class A, what would you do? Is this to say, actually, we need to look at all drugs, or would you exclude certain drugs?
All drugs. All drugs. Because remember where I come from, I was a police officer and serious crime squad, drug squad officer, etc. I've spent a career fighting this war on drugs. So my view is tainted by that experience of watching this market grow that prohibition has caused. We've caused this marketplace. So I'm coming from a slightly different angle. But at LEAP, there's three things that we cry out for. One is the decriminalisation of people who use drugs for support or whatever, all drugs. And the second part is, and it goes hand in hand, it's no use one without the other. It needs regulation of all drugs. And the stronger the drugs are, the more potent drugs are, the more they need regulated, like skunk, as you mentioned, David. And the third part of that is to redirect the resources that we're currently throwing down the drain, trying to enforce useless laws that we will never win, because the marketplace is the marketplace and there will always be people to fill that vacuum. That's to put in the help and support and directional signs that people need to make different life choices. David, in Scotland, are you aware of the violence reduction unit that we founded here in Scotland?
Yeah, a little.
Okay, well, the principles are all that matters, is that instead of chasing people about the streets and taking knives off them and locking them up, we took time to take a step back and think, why are people carrying weapons? Why is violence the choice on the streets? And we got into the communities, we got into the establishments where these people live and work and spend their days, and turned that around, and we now have 50% of the violent crime that we did have in Scotland 22 years ago. So the principles are there. They've been there for years and years and years. We used it in Leith after a murder in Edinburgh, where we created a no-go zone, a no prosecution zone in the red light district in Leith. And the crime disappeared because the police were then working with people instead of ostracising them and sending them to prison.
And your common sense therefore makes sense, so that if you actually have safe supplies of these drugs, you remove county lines, you remove crime, and therefore you solve a number of problems. Excuse me, just very quickly. A message from Claire. Good morning, great show and a great chat with Simon. I'm Scottish. I've dealt with addiction for years. I've lost many friends. The war on drugs has always been a war on people taking drugs. I love the common sense. I will look for Simon's podcast. Simon, thanks ever so much for talking to me this morning. That's Simon McLean, former undercover detective, Serious Drugs Crime Surveillance Squad and member of LEAP UK. That's Law Enforcement Action